Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Teacher Talk. I am so thrilled you're choosing to spend some time with me here on this platform, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our newest interview participant, and that is Dr. Chris Willard. He is psychologist, author of both kids and adults books, and he keeps putting out amazing content, and I'm so excited to share some of this content with you today. Chris, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh my gosh, it's great to be here again. Yeah, so good to see you.
Thank you. And it's so lovely. You know, we've had the opportunity to connect a few times. We've never met in person, but every time we have a conversation, I just feel like we're a little bit of kindred spirits, and so exciting to be doing this work together.
Yeah.
So I want to jump in right away to your newest book, which I am so excited to see. And this book is called We Grow Through What We Go Through. It's a book for adults. And I love the concept because what you talk about in this book is how to use compassion, self-compassion practices to help you go through what you call post-traumatic growth. Can you tell us a little bit about what spurred you to write this book?
Absolutely. It started the beginning of the pandemic, when I was, thinking I was never going to work again, and the world seemed like it was just a very frightening place, for many reasons, between the pandemic and climate change and social upheaval and political challenges and all kinds of things and world over too. Um,
Mhm.
and and then at the macro level and then at the personal level, just struggles like my mom was slowly developing a really horrifying form of dementia called Lewy body dementia, and in and out of the hospital with other health concerns. And of course, during COVID, this was terrifying. And so, I was thinking, never going to work again. And then I started to get, all my flights are canceled, all this, and then I got asked to suddenly do a bunch of workshops for companies and schools around wellness and around trauma and around these really important topics, resilience. And so I started diving into some of the research on resilience and trauma. And one of the first things that popped out at me was something I'd learned a long time ago, but I'd really forgotten about, which is that after we go through difficult experiences like a trauma, actually only a small percentage of people actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And actually more people develop what's called post-traumatic growth. And that actually, not to sort of fall into the trap of toxic positivity, that actually for a lot of people, they experience both at the same time. And that they just happen on different timelines. But there are, in the mindfulness world, we often talk about causes and conditions. There are conditions under which they're most likely to happen, that we have this post-traumatic growth. And so I got really curious about how do we cultivate these conditions for our families, for our communities, for our schools, for our kids, for hopefully society, which felt, and continues to feel often like it's still falling apart or very frayed, but before, during, and after this time. So that's where it came from, and at the same time wanting to help people understand trauma more deeply, and also break some of the myths that it's like a life sentence, or that it is untreatable, or that there's no way through it, and hopefully, what I put out there helps. Both so it started as a workshop. Actually, I started doing for companies and schools. And then I was like, oh, if I wrote this down, I'd have another book. And that's usually how I write. I do a workshop. If I wrote this down, I'd have a book. And so here we are.
And then it appears, and
Later.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. Can you tell us how, because what I loved, and I think it's so beautiful what you do, is you give people permission to recognize that the struggles, the traumas, the stresses, the suffering we go through, we actually have, opportunity in some of it without that toxic positivity. I love how you brought that up, but to grow, to learn, and that most of us can't avoid the struggles in our life. We don't necessarily all go through huge traumas, but we do suffer. And you linked self-compassion in there. Can you tell us why that sort of fit with what you were talking about?
Yeah. To me, self-compassion, as there are many ways to understand it, but I think one of the things that it does is it allows us to create a trusting attachment to ourselves effectively, right? We think about attachment trauma or disrupted attachment, whether it's a parent and child or a caregiver, there's been a violation, or a relationship where there's been a violation. of trust, or people have a lack of trust in their own bodies, perhaps after an illness or some kind of injury, or for many people who are from marginalized groups, there's almost like a disrupted attachment to the larger society that says, you don't belong here, we don't want you here, there's something wrong with you because of where you're from or the color of your skin or who you love or how you identify. And so all of that basically is a trauma, or is very similar physiologically to trauma. And what self-compassion does is it begins to help us cultivate something of it, and that often turns into that inner critic that we talk about in the self-compassion world. And what self-compassion helps us do, what mindfulness helps us do, is not believe everything we think, which is amazing once we start to realize that. And that was really mind-blowing for me in my mindfulness journey. And then it also, self-compassion helps us to not believe that critical voice and to start to be able to listen in and find, perhaps, even if it takes a long time, a more compassionate inner voice that can be like that parent that we never had, or that group that we never felt a part of, or whoever or whatever it was that was supposed to nurture us that we didn't get. And we begin to heal our nervous systems, we heal our bodies, we heal our brains, we heal our relationships in these new ways. And we can see that happening at the cellular level as well as at the relational and hopefully global level as the compassion begins to ripple out.
I love that. And I just love how you say, the practice and takes time, but is that connecting to that compassionate voice, that we have that within us, right? That we can find the words and that's the practice. How did you start your practice? What brought you to mindfulness and compassion?
Yeah, I mean,
So,
the story, I sort of, my origin story, it's sort of as a kid, just sort of like wonderful time in nature at camp and with my parents and that kind of thing. And I think for many of us, that is that first sort of mindfulness before we heard the word mindfulness.
yeah.
And then sort of in a more formal way, it really happened. I had been struggling a lot in college or university, I suppose you'd say, anywhere else in the world besides America. Couple years in, really struggling with addiction, depression, anxiety. Took some time off to, sort of like the more privileged class I'm from would say, find myself, or you might say, get my shit together, depending on how you look at that. And after a year of kind of more misery, discovering therapy, finding it somewhat helpful, trying to get sober, things like that, my parents basically dragged me on a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh in 1999, basically out of a park where I was, and drove me there where they were going. And it was really transformative. Like suddenly I felt happier, I felt more at peace, I felt more compassion for others, I felt more compassion for myself. I felt that love that Ty was radiating, as well as the rest of the community, that I couldn't figure out how to get for myself. Was able to kind of take it in, that sort of, in the 12-step world, sort of, we'll love you till you can love yourself kind of thing. And that's very much what happened in the mindfulness community as well. And from there, did get my shit together basically, but with a real passion for mindfulness, which then informed every step of my journey since then, 20 some years ago. I went back to school, studied English, was a special education teacher for a few years at a residential school for actually adolescent sex offenders. I had no educational experience, had no special ed experience, had no idea what I was doing. Really challenging work, and I still have so much respect for educators, especially special educators, because I was like, I'm going to do the easy. Those therapists, they get to be the good cop. I'm going to, get the easy job. So that's why I did it. Being a therapist has its own challenges, but I have so much respect for classroom educators and educators just being on the front lines in that way. And all through this time, thinking I'm going to teach these kids mindfulness, and then realizing, oh, okay, I can't yell at them to breathe. Like I need to maybe do my own work here around mindfulness, around compassion. And then maybe 10 years into my practice, Chris Germer, who some listeners might be familiar with, is literally a neighbor of mine, a mentor of mine. We've, kind of known each other for a long time. And he and I were chatting one day, and it was around when I was working on my first book, and he was working on his first book about self-compassion. And I thought, I remember walking away from that conversation being like, that's such a cool idea. No one's gonna buy that book. But boy, was I wrong, right? And then, went to some of his early workshops and was like, whoa, wow, this is amazing. This is like, accelerant, like pouring gasoline on the mindfulness fire, and really transformative. And I'm still not perfect, like I still self-criticize, but I was joking on a podcast recently. It's like I've gone from saying to myself when I screw up, like, you fucking asshole, to and meaning it, to being like, oh, you like jackass, like it's like,
Totally.
it's not perfection, I suppose, but it's like kinder and lighter, and I don't
Yeah.
beat myself up nearly as much. And often
Love
it's
it.
not even that harsh. Like often it's just like, okay, just start again.
Yeah.
And that's been really transformative for me.
Well, and I mean, I had the privilege of learning with Chris Grimmer too, and he's such an amazing human being. And I learned through that process too of listening to my inner critic. And tone makes such a difference. I often say to people, it doesn't matter actually what you say to yourself, it's how you say it, right? Like
Right.
it's yeah, that's it, right? And you can
People
be
don't
as
remember
you
what you
can
said,
call
they'll
yourself
remember
as
how you
many
made them
names as
feel. It's true when we give it to ourselves also. Like,
right,
yeah.
right. Like I often joke with people, if you hold a brand new baby in your arms and you look down at it, you can say the worst things in the world, but if you say it in a loving voice, that baby's just going to
It's
adore
true.
you.
Right,
But if
right,
you look at that baby and you say loving things in a real harsh and critical tone, that baby's going to start to cry.
right.
And it's like our own heart responds in the same way. And so I think that's one of the things that we start to learn when we're practicing compassion is just that, like, for me, it's like, oh, girl, like, really, you're going there today? And I've
Right,
been practicing
right,
this for a long time. It doesn't mean I don't still hear my like. So
right,
I think
right.
it's I love how you say it's a practice, and I appreciate your connections to education too. And I'm curious if you had any barriers to supporting educators or bringing this work into mindfulness, bringing this work around mindfulness and compassion in education. What are some of the like pushbacks or the struggles you think educators feel when they start to I mean, know this. I love how you shared you had a transformative experience. And some people are getting this in like not really small doses, right? So how do we like what sort of resistance do you think you see in schools right now with this work?
I mean, I think what breaks my heart is that so many people everywhere in the corporate space. I was on a call with an HR department this morning, and also in education, where I spend 90% of my time working with people, is the number of really bad mindfulness trainings. It's like, and I now feel like I have to go in a little bit on the defensive and be like, I'm not just gonna come in and tell you to take a deep breath, like, and
Mm,
it's like, then I have to come in and then like try to argue, like, here's the science behind breathing, and here's how to breathe in a way that actually works, and here's how to fit it into your day. And I think so
yeah,
many people are going in and showing, excuse me, telling, not showing, the benefits of mindfulness and practicing together with a group of people, that I think in some ways it's done some damage to the ideas of mindfulness and compassion. I know that everyone is so well-meaning, but I think that's been really tough.
mm,
And so I find it sometimes there's a bit more of a skeptical crowd being like, and I think I also just want to acknowledge, like, that when people, especially educators, are like, we don't need, gratitude and affirmations and mindfulness, we need more resources. That's also true. And I think what's
mhm,
important is that we recognize, and I think one of the problems with polarization in our societies and around the world, is that so many arguments have become, it's this or that. It's not just political. It's like even in these other spaces where people are, I think, more caring and compassionate, but it's like, we need more mindfulness and breathing, and we need more resources. Like, and I can't get you resource. I can't, I can tell your superintendent, which is the name of the person who's in charge in the US, to give you all raises, but I don't know if that's going to work, but I can tell you how to do some self-care. And that's all I
yeah,
got. Like, you talk to the
yeah,
voters if you want other change. And I think that is also really hard, but I think it's also important, for educators to recognize, and all of us to recognize, it's both. It's not one or the
yeah.
other. And
I love that. And I think it's also, I so appreciate you saying that and acknowledging it. And I think what I also hear from lots of people is that it's just one more thing. Like you're just telling me we're already having to change our assessment, understand how to, ask good questions in school and, report on so many things. There's a list of things educators feel. And now you want us to learn this thing called mindfulness. And when I first start practicing, it's not very good. It's hard. I don't really like it. Like it doesn't necessarily feel at ease. So why would I do this? Why would you, or they get that, like you said, I've come in and I've listened to this chat with, Dr. Chris Willard, check, I've got the mindfulness thing, I'm on, and they haven't settled into that being a practice. And I love how you say community connection. This is the foundation. It's something I really believe in. And the other thing I hear from educators, and I'm wondering if you hear this too, is they want to teach it, but they don't actually know how to feel it or live it.
Right. And it is so important to embody these practices before we start teaching them. And I'm also like, I'm a little bit controversial. I think there's a lot of sort of like everyone who teaches mindfulness should go on a retreat twice a year. And I feel like that's actually super kind of classist and like, and it's like only some people can afford to go on a retreat once a year, or jobs will let them, or certainly educators, like you don't get that much vacation time. Like, I feel like that's not entirely fair. People don't have childcare or other things. But I do feel like we need to know more than the kids, and we need to have some sense of embodiment, the sort of classic, like, you don't want to read a textbook about swimming and then jump in the pool, or read a book about swimming to your kid and tell them to go jump in the pool. That'd be a really bad idea. So practicing together, and we do need to have some degree of embodiment. And I think the more embodiment we have, the more it becomes clear that this is not just a behavioral modification strategy or something like that. But I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think then this is another place where we can give educators the resources they need to learn how to embody and share this. And I also go back and forth. I don't feel like every educator in the school building needs to be the mindfulness teacher. It's like, this is going to be great for some people. And if there's a chance, hopefully that it'll get like this kindergarten teacher's into it and this first grade and that art teacher and maybe the, soccer coach or something like that. And then kids will get some exposure as they're growing up. It doesn't have to be a mandate, because I don't feel like those tend to be very productive.
No, they don't. They don't. No, you're totally right. I think that's the most important thing we can be an educator. I talk to a lot of educators. They're like, I wish everybody in my school did this. And I was like, yeah, well, we all need to show up authentically to what we believe in and what we know, right? Yeah. And I think if a practice around mindfulness supports your practice in your classroom and it helps you be present, that's the most important thing, because we're just planting seeds with kids, and kids will learn many different messages. And it's not like by the time they leave grade 2, they've got mindfulness and they're set for life. Like, I don't know about you, but I still have to practice pretty regularly with this concept, right? And so it's not like one thing around learning some words, you got it, you can move on to the next step. It's like it's an ongoing practice. And I think that's, I think there's that permission. That's where I love this practice around compassion, self-compassion, compassion in schools. It's because it gives us permission to be authentic, to say, how do I bring myself and what I believe in and trust that other people are planting other seeds with students, and how do I just bring my presence in? Yeah.
And I think that's so important. It's like, I can maybe plant, and I'm also honestly better at planting the mindfulness seed among the educators than I am with the kids. Like, and that's okay. And someone else, they're maybe actually better at planting it with the kids than I am. And that's okay. And someone else is better at planting the conversations around compassion or around equity or around math or around like who knows what. And that's okay. We all have our strengths. And I think that's also important. And when we have a little bit more of a mindful approach, open-minded approach, compassionate approach to life, I think we're able to see that and let go of that push and pull of, this is my purview, that's yours, or everyone should do this, or no one should do that. And people are able to actually all be their best, which is what we want everyone to do, is like bring their best authentic self to the kids. Absolutely.
And I just have to name too, like the other thing it does is it helps us, as you were saying, grow in resiliency. And, when we have this practice, I'm just listening, you and I started before here, and you said, I've got some renovations going on and there's a saw
You can
going
hear them
and I
now.
can hear it. And I just want to name that because, for some of us, we could feel like, oh my gosh, this is happening. It's super stressful. And what I think this practice does is it allows us to go, this is happening. I'm here now. It doesn't matter. I can go with it. And
Yeah.
I think it's a really beautiful way to say, like, the stress around us is going to go on. We can't stop the saws and the renovations in the moments when we're having these conversations, but we can still recognize whatever's coming up and be present through it. And I think this is where this foundational practice can be so helpful.
Right.
You talk a little bit more around this concept around mindfulness and trauma. Do you have a little bit of information around how you teach that or how that works and what you do when you share it?
I do.
Or sharing? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I feel this funny way about the focus on trauma right now, which is on the one hand, I think it's this amazing thing that we're actually becoming more trauma aware and more trauma informed. And at the same time, it's also a little bit of a bubble and a little bit of a trend. And actually, from the psychotherapy angle, I can look historically at, like, in the 90s, everyone had ADD, every kid had ADD. And in the early 2000s, every kid had childhood bipolar. And by the, 20 teens, every child was diagnosed on the spectrum. And now every kid is diagnosed with trauma. And it's not that those aren't true, but it's that, we have these trends. And one thing that happens is that we then get a lot more recognition, but we also get a lot more misinformation at the end time and sort of overdiagnosis, which then actually means that we miss certain kids. So I just want to put that out there and say this is a good thing, but also they say in medical school, they say, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. And I think, what the idea behind that being, if it looks like ADD, it's probably ADD. But what we want to do when we're trauma aware is think, this is probably ADD, but let me also remember there could be other stuff going on in this kid's life. If I think about their adverse childhood experiences, if I think about what I know about this family, let me also just entertain that. So now when I look at a kid who's misbehaving or messing up my class or whatever it might be, I can think, maybe it's ADD, maybe they're hungry, maybe they didn't sleep, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's depression, maybe there's some trauma here. And what we want to do is be able to think about all of those and add this to our list of this maybe is what's explaining this behavior, not this is definitely what it is. So I want to start with that. The other thing I want to say to educators is that, which I say to educators when I do this talk, is say, what's the Dr. Spock line, Benjamin Spock? He says, trust yourself, you know more than you think you do. And I think there's a lot of anxiety. If I teach this lesson, am I going to trigger this kid? If I call on this kid, am I going to trigger them in some way? And I would guess that anyone listening to your your series here, Lisa, is probably not doing that, right? You're probably actually trauma aware enough that you're probably not unintentionally triggering kids, right? Yeah. And most of it's like basics. It's like, don't yell at a kid. Don't get mad if a kid is sleeping. It means they need sleep. Like let them go to the nurse's office and take a nap. Like, if they're acting up, like look at whether they're hungry and there's food insecurity at home. Don't just assume that they're a bad kid or that they're traumatized. Like let's look holistically at each child. But I also know that that's really hard for educators to do when you've got 30 kids in your class and lesson plans to get through. But I want to say you're probably already doing a good job. So keep up the good work to everybody out there. And then we can think, okay, how can we make sure we are sharing things in a trauma-aware way, especially as it relates to mindfulness and compassion? What we know about self-compassion is that sometimes when we give ourselves compassion, we realize we haven't experienced it and it feels strange, like mindfulness does. This is weird, I'm not used to this. And so that leads to a behavior. I'm not used to this, so then I don't like it, so I want to make it stop, and I do a behavior to make it stop. The other thing that happens with compassion is, this is really nice. I haven't experienced this before. I'm actually kind of angry about the fact that I haven't experienced this from teachers before, or from classmates, or from my parent or caregiver. And that can maybe create some feelings, which then with kids in particular turns into behaviors. We call this backdraft in the self-compassion world. So we want to look at all of this as to why things might be happening. But I think one of the things we want to recognize about trauma is it happens when we feel out of control and a lack of choice. And so I have this little acronym I use, CHOICE. It stands for consent. The H is honesty, help, and humility. O is orientation, I is inquiry, C is choice and comfort, E is embody, empower, and equity. And that first C around consent is so important, right? We don't want to push kids beyond their limits. We also want to recognize that contemplative practices, compassion, mindfulness, these are not the be all and end all. This is not going to fix everything, that a lot of kids need more than just this, or something even besides this. And we always want to push kids out of their comfort zone, but we want to keep them within their safety zone. And in a classroom, that's especially important because your role is different than being a therapist, even though in the last few years, it's maybe seemed like your role as a therapist. It doesn't have to be. That can be a relief, right, for you, hopefully, as educators, not having to do that job. So pushing kids to challenge themselves, but also to stay safe, that's important. H being help, humility, and honesty. That means ask for help if you need it. Teach with someone who's got more experience in mindfulness, or teach with a mental health professional. Be honest about what these practices are, not this is going to fix everything in your life. And also be humble. Let your kids know these aren't easy for you. They're not easy for everybody. And also acknowledge where these practices come from. O is orientation, which is making sure, again, when anyone experiences trauma, things are so unpredictable. So one of the things that's important is we say, this will be a 3-minute practice. We're going to focus on our breath and we're going to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
That's different than saying, we're going to close our eyes for who knows how long. Like, that's terrifying. Of course, kids are going to act out, right?
Yeah.
And then closing the session with a little grounding, reorient yourself. It's a beautiful spring day, here in Victoria, wherever you are, Lisa, right? And then it's sort of like orient to time and place, because some kids might be a little bit more dissociative or sleepy. Don't shame kids if it takes them a minute to kind of come back, in a sense, if it's a longer practice, right? Let them ground with their senses. Like, these kinds of things are really important for those kids. I for inquiry, just, not forcing it. Share if you want to, you don't have to. Again, the next C for choice and comfort, like, don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to sit this way. You don't have to even do this practice, but we do ask that you be quiet and respectful to everyone else who does want to practice. Comfortable posture. And then lastly, E for embodiment, right? That we embody mindfulness and not, Lisa, breathe, right? That's just, who wants that, right? Empowerment, also empowering our students, especially if there's been trauma, to speak up. Hey, this isn't working for me. Hey, this is working for me. Like that's really important. When kids have been disempowered through trauma, to try to re-empower them. And then teaching with an equity mindset is also really important, that there's a little bit more kind of acknowledgement of equity. And I think at the same time, acknowledging the source of these practices with humility and cultural humility when we can is also really important too. So that's the really brief kind of version that I do. But thank you for asking about that.
Yeah, no, and it's something I've read this work from you, and I really love it. And I think it's so important if we are specifically trying to share mindfulness or compassion practices with students. And I'll make sure I link and describe all those, in the blurb below, so people can go back and have another look at it and link to your work about it, because I think it is really, really important if we are sharing mindfulness. And the other thing that I heard from you is in the very beginning, before you started that even, was that, when we start, sometimes kids, like you talked about backdraft and you talked about change in behavior because of this. And we have sometimes our own reaction to that because we want them to understand this, or we want them to get it, or, we want to keep a nice classroom and we want to make things easy. And what I think about in all of that is, whatever we teach, the most important thing is we're aware of our own reactions. Yeah. Because I think that's the most foundation part in a classroom. A kid, flies off the wall because it's hard. It's not a reflection on you, but how do you meet yourself in that moment as like, yeah, this is hard for that kid. That beautiful lens around being trauma aware of, like, maybe this kid, this is hard for them. Maybe they haven't eaten. They're asleep in my classroom. Am I shaming them for that? Or am I just aware, like, I'm having a trigger response myself to the sleeping, the reaction, and how am I meeting myself in this moment?
Yeah,
you have something to say about that, I can tell.
No, I'm just saying, like, well, we personalize those things, and it's so not personal. And I think also when we think holistically, it's like, one of the other acronyms I really like is the HALT acronym. Like, are you hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? It sort of comes out of self-help and addiction stuff, but it's also like, this is why, like, if you're any of those things, then your prefrontal cortex, pardon me, is not working, right? And if a
Yeah.
kid is dysregulated, that's part of it. It's like, they, like,
Yeah.
that kid maybe didn't eat. Do you have a couple of granola bars in your desk? And I want to say that is not a teacher's job, but unfortunately it is, right? It's
It
both
is.
and. Like, you
Yeah.
should not have to have a granola bar in your desk to feed that kid, but it's also really important for them and for you, if you want the class to
Yeah.
go well, that that kid who didn't get
Totally.
breakfast has that, right? Is that kid falling asleep in your class, right? Maybe they were out partying. Maybe they were caring for their, mom who came home drunk at 4 a.m. and they got no sleep, or who knows what. And maybe you
Yeah.
say, you let them sleep, or you give them a note to go to the nurse's office and take a nap, right?
Yeah.
That we try to see, like, what else could be really going on in this kid's life, and not shame them for it, but actually let them get their, Maslow's hierarchy of needs met, like sleep and eating and shelter and these other things, like, in whatever way we can within the purview of our job, which again is so hard being an educator right now, when you are teacher and educator and social worker and therapist and, medical,
Totally.
public health enforcement and masks. And it's like, oh my gosh, what's that stat about, like, educators make more decisions in a minute than emergency room doctors? I mean, it's like, it's outrageous. Yeah.
And then this is why the practice of compassion is the foundation for these educators.
Right.
It's because of exactly what you said, because we have to meet ourselves so that we can meet our students. And the best trauma-informed approach is relationships, right? Like, it's knowing our kids. That's it. And the only way we can have the space and the time and the energy and the capacity to build good relationships is that we've created that space for ourselves. And so, teach it, bring it to your students, but most of all, land in it for yourself, know it, embody it, feel it, so you can, because I think, as you said in the very beginning, kids will remember how you make them feel, not necessarily what you say, like there's that beautiful, Maya Angelou quote. And I think it's the most important thing we can do and offer for our very overworked and very overwhelmed and very overexhausted educators these days.
For sure.
Well, my friend, I am so grateful we've had this conversation. I think this is going to support so many educators out there. I love it. I always like to end and leave on a pretty silly question, but many people who've been following this know that one of my ways of decompressing and de-stressing myself is I have these things, I call them kitchen dance parties. So at the end of a long day, I throw on my tunes while I'm making my dinner. Instead of sitting here like banging pots and pans in a stress, I throw on a song and I dance. And I, sometimes it's slow and easy. Sometimes it's, I'm jumping up and down in my kitchen, but it definitely shifts my mood. So I have a question for you. If you had one guilty pleasure song, like if this song came on and you heard it and you could be like, I have to dance, I got to get on the dance floor, this is the one song that would not like keep me sitting. What is there one song that's your guilty pleasure dance song?
I don't know what exactly that would be. I'm really like an awkward dancer, but I will tell you, I'm also like really I'm like, as a public speaker, this is like, ridiculous, right? Same with karaoke, but my karaoke song is Sunshine, Lollipops and Rainbows by Leslie Gore. So that's a totally ridiculous song. That's also only like 70 seconds, but I can do it very well. So I'll give you that.
So next time you're all with Chris in a karaoke bar, that's the song you're putting on.
After the
conference. I'm going to add it. I love it. I'm going to add it to my list. I have a Spotify list going of awesome kitchen dance parties, and every person I get to speak with, I throw their song on. So that one is going to go on for someone, they're going to dance around their kitchen with you and think of Chris as we're in the karaoke bar having that song. My friend, thanks for ending this with a smile on your face. I am so grateful for this conversation. Have a really lovely rest of your day.
You too.